Welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to share a little bit about shadow work, which is a very specific type of inner work or approach to inner work. And I'm going to share 3 different aspects or approaches to inner work, 2 of which are almost always completely ignored. But first off, here is my take on what shadow work is. Shadow work, or shadows in particular, shadows are the parts of ourselves, our stories, our narratives, our events, our traumas, things that have happened, the way we process. They're the parts of ourselves and our identity that we don't want to look at. We'd rather they stay behind us. That's why we call them shadows. It all comes from the 1950s when Carl Jung had this idea and he said every single person has a dark side to their personality. And that's a shadow. It's not a bad place. It's not a good place. It just is what it is. And so when we do shadow work or we engage or talk about shadow work, what we're really talking about is how are we engaging, working with, playing with those parts of ourselves, which takes us to the first level or area or component of shadow work, which is the personal. Each one of us has shadows. We have shadows in our narratives like I'm not good enough, narratives like I'm not in control, narratives like I'm not lovable. Those are all narratives that might exist in our psyche, exist in our unconscious. They might exist in our conscious. We know about them. We know that the shadow exists, but we don't want to deal with it. Let's leave it in the dark. Let's leave it in the past. So we have personal shadows. And when we engage in personal shadow work, some of the practices that can really help: journaling, working with a therapist or other mental health professional, doing things like going for long walks and pondering or actively while we're in an embodied state, like moving or movement or walking or running or playing racquetball, but processing those shadows and the impacts of those shadows in our life so that we can start teasing apart, how is this impacting me? How is this impacting my relationship? How is this impacting the way I view myself? And how is this impacting my movement or navigation of my communities? This is why I often talk about personal inner work is never, ever, ever isolated work, because what we do in our personal lives impacts the communities we walk in and move in the same way that our communities that we are shaped and formed in impact us and our personal shadow work. So when I talk about personal shadow work, those are what are the parts of my life? What are the parts of your life, of your personal, intimate story? What are the aspects that you would rather ignore and leave in the dark? And how do we little by little, in a very gentle and affirming and life-honoring way, how do we bring them out, tease them out, so that we can work with them little by little? The second component of shadow work that I think often gets missed is communal shadow work. And that doesn't mean you're doing your personal shadow work with other people, although that might be a really important aspect of your personal shadow work. Communal shadow work is when we look at the communities that we operate within, our families, our church communities, our places we volunteer, our schools, our workplaces. Those are each of our communities. And shadow work can be done at that level and in those spaces as well. And so we return to our definition of personal shadow work, the parts of ourselves that we'd rather not look at, the parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. And we just translate that into the community. When you think about your workplace, what are the stories, the narratives, the histories, or the events that have occurred within that community that especially those who have power in that community would rather everyone just leave in the dark, leave in the past, not talk about, rub some dirt on it and move on? Those are communal shadows. And anyone within that community, no matter their social placement within that community, can begin to do that communal shadow work one by one, and then naming what you're realizing to another person, building solidarity and connection to a point that you've got multiple people within the community saying, we need to publicly address this shadow. We need to work with this shadow in this specific way. Here's a practice I really like doing when it comes to communal shadow work. Just notice when defensiveness shows up, or specifically mass defensiveness. So if you're in a workplace and all of a sudden some idea gets brought up, or a memory gets brought up, or someone shares, hey, remember when we used to do that thing? If there is a person or group of people that respond with, whoa, 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 we can't do that. Whoa, 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 there's no way. Whoa, 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 any of those things. If you notice the pullback, that posture of nope, or of defensiveness, or all of a sudden on guard, chances are there's a communal shadow underneath that, especially if it's people who are in power. So if your workplace leaders, your bosses, your employers, if they are responding to things that are occurring within the company or within the workplace, and they're pulling back with lots of defensiveness, saying, whoa, we can't talk about that. This isn't the place for that. How about we do that in a one-on-one instead? Those are often, not always, but those are often triggers or flags. They're often flags that there's some sort of communal shadow underneath. And that brings us now to the third aspect of shadow work, because defensiveness has a lot to do with this third one as well. The third component of shadow work is what I call societal shadow work. And so we take the same definition, and I want you to remember the defensiveness piece. We take the same definition as before. In our society, what are the things that are taught to us as not to be questioned, too big to fail? If you mention this, bad things will happen. Let's just ignore it. Let's move on. I specifically think of things like meritocracy. I think about things like white supremacy. I think about things like the prison industrial complex. I think about things like policing. These are untouchable topics, and when they do get mentioned, when they get noticed, talked about, there is this massive defensiveness that breaks out. If you talk about defunding the police like we have been since 2020 and long before, but when that conversation comes up, you immediately get this defensiveness that occurs. Whoa, 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 you can't even talk about that. And that points to a societal shadow, something that has largely been said, we're going to put that away, not mess with it. Don't speak about it, let's ignore it. That's a societal shadow. And you can notice these both externally. You turn on the news, societal shadows are everywhere. You just got to look for what is the thing that's not being said? What is the thing that's too big to fail? What is the narrative that no one is supposed to engage with? But you can also check societal shadows within yourself. And this is where the societal work and the communal work all come together with the personal shadow work. In myself, where are these societal shadows? Thinking about policing, white supremacy, meritocracy, impacts of capitalism. When do I police myself to a point that I don't let myself engage with these narratives? And here's a practice you can really work with. Actually, I'm going to share two of them. The first one is what I call the questioning practice. And it goes really simple. You notice something in the world, or you notice something within yourself. That's the first step. Write it down on a piece of paper. What are you noticing? The second step is that on a piece of paper, you take 10 minutes, write down every single question you can possibly brainstorm about that thing you're noticing. There's no right or wrong, good or bad. In education, we call this a brain dump. You just let it all flow out, get it on paper. Step 3 is after those 10 minutes, you look back at your questions, you identify which are the 3 that are most potent, most resonant, most important for me at this moment in my life to wrestle with, move with, understand deeper, research. And then step 4 of the questioning practice is, what are the supports you need? Do you need to set aside time? Do you need to go talk with a friend? Do you need to set up an appointment with your therapist? What do you need in order to honestly engage with the questions that your inner life is bubbling up around those societal shadows? Then there's a second practice, and this is called peel the fruit. And I'll leave a link to it in the resources section, but peel the fruit, here's what it basically does. It allows you to look at what you're noticing and then little by little hone in until you can understand the root causes of any given issue. When it comes to societal shadow work, this is vital. Being able to work from what are you noticing, deeper, 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 deeper. What are the narratives? What are the events? What are the underlying root causes? What are the fears? And that's where you'll begin to really find those societal shadows and what is driving them and perpetuating them. So those are the 3 levels of shadow work: personal shadow work, communal shadow work, and societal shadow work. If you found this interesting, if you want to go deeper, you can check out other videos. I'm planning on releasing several, just kind of my fundamental, these are my aspects or my approaches to inner work, but you can also check out the links that I'm posting in the resources section.